3 ivory buttons conceal a murderous secret. Welcome to Sayers and Secrets. I am your host, Esteban Rocha. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your insights make every clue sharper. Now, the case begins. If there's one thing I've learned working for Nero Wolfe, aside from how to spell quindecennial and survive on beer and sarcasm, it's this. The brownstone does not entertain drop-ins. People who ring that doorbell uninvited usually get a door closed in their face, followed by Fritz's apologetic Austrian murmur and a sharp command from the office. Archie, handle it. So when the buzzer rang at 10:07 a.m. on a damp Wednesday in October, and Wolfe was precisely one paragraph deep into Pliny the Elder, I should have known it wasn't going to be a florist or a stray census taker. I left my typewriter, mid-report, strolled past the orchids just to check on the latest of Wolfe's 57 unnamed darlings, and opened the door. She was tall, taller than me, which isn't something I mention often, and had the look of someone who'd walked several blocks too fast while thinking too hard. Elegant, wind-blown, and visibly annoyed that she hadn't already solved the world's problems. Her coat was buttoned lopsided, and her lipstick had missed a corner. But the real showstopper wasn't her face or figure. It was the gaping void on her coat. 3 ivory buttons, all missing in a perfect row. "Mr. Wolfe?" she asked. Her voice had authority and music. "Is he accepting clients today?" I looked her up and down, not for pleasure, purely procedural, and leaned on the doorframe. "Depends. Are you bringing him food, a medieval manuscript, or something that'll offend his sense of domestic order?" She raised a hand and extended an envelope. It was creamstock, monogrammed with a faint blue R, and smelled like expensive leather and nervous hands. I was told he might help. I need someone precise. Someone who doesn't care for theatrics. I couldn't help it. "You came to the wrong building. Follow me." Wolfe didn't lift his eyes when we entered the office, nor did he acknowledge the footsteps on his Persian rug. He let her stand there like a coat rack waiting to be noticed, and I let it play out. That's our dynamic. Wolfe performs silence. Like it's music and I provide the interludes, she brought an envelope, no food, and something peculiar about her coat, I said, returning to my desk. "Remove your coat," Wolfe said abruptly, finally looking up from Pliny, "and sit." That caught her off guard, but she complied. When she sat, gracefully, I'll give her that, her handbag toppled and scattered its contents. Pens, tissues, a silver compact, and what looked like a folded note with 3 small puncture holes. I leaned forward but didn't touch anything. Wolfe, however, closed his book. "That's a sign of deep peril or deep interest. I'm Rachel Vernay," she said. "I work for Ravenspur Press." "Small-run publisher," I offered, watching Wolfe's eyebrows twitch. "You do those high-end reprints of obscure European crime novels, the ones with forewords that quote Nietzsche." She blinked. "Yes, and we're currently preparing a limited edition of The Iron Fleece, which you may have heard of." "I haven't," Wolfe grunted. "But Mr. Goodwin has a perverse appetite for mediocrity. Go on." She pressed her lips together. "We received an anonymous package last Friday. No return address. Inside was a first-edition copy of The Iron Fleece, an unsigned note, and 3 ivory buttons." Wolfe raised a hand. "Buttons?" She reached into her bag again, hesitated, and placed a small glassine pouch on his desk. Inside were 3 identical ivory buttons, smooth, rounded, and faintly yellowed with age. "I had 4, she said, glancing at her coat. "Until this morning." Wolfe tapped a finger on his armrest. "Go back. The note?" Nodded, retrieving the folded paper. I took it carefully, scanned it. The note read, "Truth stitched into lies leaves loose threads. The fleece was never iron, and the shepherd never innocent. Look again." There was no signature, but the typewriter's font was distinctive. Older, faded ribbon and slightly crooked alignment. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "You presume someone wants to sabotage your edition?" "Or protect it," she said. "The editor we hired, Julian Creel, resigned the same day the package arrived." He said something had come up, and then he vanished. His phone disconnected. He left a single voicemail, very brief. All it said was, "They know I changed the ending." That got even Wolfe to blink. Only once, but for him that's like a thunderclap. Within minutes we had the following: a vanishing editor, an anonymous warning, a rare book, and 3 buttons that had once belonged to our new client. I asked the obvious, "Miss Vernet, are you implying someone stole your buttons to prove a point?" She didn't flinch. "I'm implying someone tampered with the manuscript and that someone else is trying to expose it through symbols. That's—" When Wolfe pushed back his chair just slightly, he reached for the bell. "Fritz, we will have lunch delayed by 20 minutes. Bring coffee." The man was in, not because of the buttons or even the cryptic note. No, Wolfe doesn't bend for drama. But the idea of intellectual forgery, the falsification of something literary, something published, was a heresy that could not go unpunished. And with that, the sanctity of the brownstone had been officially disturbed. It's a rare occasion that Nero Wolfe agrees to delay lunch. Fritz, our live-in Swiss culinary wizard, treats the midday meal like a sacred rite, and Wolfe treats Fritz like a gastronomic high priest. So when the bell summoned him and the command came to shift our ritual by 20 whole minutes, I knew. We had crossed into territory that Wolfe considered dangerous to the mind, if not the stomach. Rachel Vernet sat quietly on the red leather chair by the globe bar, her legs crossed, her gloved fingers resting on her knee in a pose that probably came naturally to her but looked rehearsed. She didn't fidget, she didn't flutter. She watched Wolfe as though trying to solve him, which made me like her slightly more than usual for a first-time client. Most people try to impress him. She tried to decode him. Wolfe had returned to his chair and tilted his head slightly in. That way, that meant the chessboard was forming behind his eyes. He spoke without moving much more than his lips. "Miss Vernet, I must understand the foundation. What is your professional connection to this manuscript?" "I'm the commissioning editor," she said. "We publish out-of-print mysteries and thrillers that deserve another life. Curated editions, thoughtful typesetting, archival introductions. The Iron Fleece was our next flagship project. We contracted Julian Creel, a former literary critic and scholar of obscure European detective fiction, to write the introduction and prepare the annotated version. He worked on it for 6 weeks. Wolfe nodded faintly. "And then?" "And then a week ago he resigned. I received the anonymous package later that day. Since then he's unreachable." "You haven't gone to the police?" She shook her head. "He hasn't been gone long enough, and technically, no crime has occurred. Just a resignation, a few cryptic messages, and some buttons." Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment. "Mr. Goodwin." "Yep." "Describe the buttons," I obliged. 3 ivory buttons, each identical. Not yellow plastic imitations. Real ivory, slightly domed, about ½ an inch across. No visible branding. Standard 4-hole type. Not from mass-market retail. "Correct," Wolfe muttered. "Custom tailoring." "That's what I thought. Her coat's tailored. Cashmere blend, hand-stitched seams, minimal lining. High-end. The buttons came from her own coat. So someone took them off." Rachel Vernet looked at me. "I didn't even notice they were gone until an hour before I arrived. I left the coat on my office chair overnight. I thought one had fallen off, but 3. "An assertion," Wolfe said flatly, "which we must verify. Were they removed with care?" "Yes," she replied. "No damage to the threads. It was like they had been extracted." Wolfe reached for his glass of water and took a single sip. his fingers momentarily caressing the rim before placing it back on the coaster. "Miss Verney," he said, "you've introduced symbols into a transaction rooted in secrecy. That complicates clarity. The theft of your buttons is a communication, so is the note. And the object stolen is not physical, it is textual. A manuscript altered, a message left." She shifted slightly. "So you believe the buttons are a warning?" "I believe someone wants you to understand that the deception in your publication is being exposed. Whether their intention is preservation, punishment, or manipulation, we must proceed as though all three are plausible." That was Wolfe's version of saying the game was on. He might have been talking about book fraud and sewing notions, but I'd seen that look before. It was the same one he had when a man walked in claiming his wife vanished after receiving rhododendron. By 1 o'clock the Ivory buttons were photographed, catalogued, and placed in Wolfe's document safe, which he insisted on, even though the contents were generally less thrilling than the term implies. The safe also held a cigar cutter from 1936 and a signed note from Horace Rugg, which Wolfe swore had once proved a man's innocence in Baltimore. While Wolfe returned to his lunch, spinach stuffed sole, courtesy of Fritz, I rang up Saul Panzer. Not because we had anything solid to track, but because if you're going to wander blindfolded, you call the man who can hear footprints. Saul didn't say much, but he agreed to dig up recent movements on Julian Creel. Last known address, calls. Placed, anyone snooping around Ravenspur Press. Meanwhile, I made a quick stop at Rachel Verney's office. It sat on the 4th floor of a building in the East 60s that smelled like ambition, coffee, and literary failure. Her assistant, a mousy brunette with a PhD in fretfulness, buzzed me in. "Miss Verney said you'd be stopping by," she said, voice taut as piano wire. I gave her a warm smile in my best non-threatening tone. "Don't worry, I'm not here to take over your job or repossess the coffee machine. Just need to look at the package Miss Verney received, the one with the buttons." She pointed me toward her boss's glass-walled office. I let myself in. The package, a manila envelope, postage stamped from a Brooklyn sorting center, was on her desk. No return. Address, of course. Inside was a mint-condition first edition of the Iron Fleece, printed in Zurich in 1934. Pages foxed but binding tight. The envelope also held a photocopy of the manuscript with annotations in blue ink. I scanned a few, corrections, strike-throughs, and odd comments. At one point in the middle of the book, Creel had written, "Remove this ending. Original intent was sabotage, not redemption." Now we were getting somewhere. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was halfway through a post-lunch beer and ensconced in his chair. "Take it," he said without looking up, "that the manuscript was not preserved." "Nope." Creel edited heavily, even questioned the ending. Of course he became ethically conflicted. He tampered with a historic text, or discovered it had already been tampered with, and then resigned. Wolfe nodded. Not out of cowardice, but because he feared the consequences of complicity. I dropped into my chair. "So what now?" "Now," Wolfe said, "we determine whether the changes he made were accidental or deliberate misdirection. Someone, perhaps the original author's estate, a rival publisher, or a hidden stakeholder, wants to ensure the original version resurfaces. And the buttons." Wolfe finally looked at me. "A mark of removal. 3 truths extracted, not destroyed. A symbolic gesture to mirror the editorial sabotage," I whistled. "You think whoever took them is the same person who sent the package?" "No," he said. "I think the person who sent the package is trying to restore the manuscript. The person who stole the buttons is trying to warn Miss Verney. And the person who altered the manuscript," he paused, "may have had a very personal reason to do so." By evening, the brownstone was quiet again, but the order of things had shifted. Wolfe stayed in the office longer than usual. The windows were shut against the damp October chill, and Fritz prepared a heavy Alsatian stew. I watched him from my usual chair as he leafed through the photocopied pages of the Iron Fleece, occasionally grunting with irritation at a note or smudge. That's when I asked him the question that had been itching since morning. "Why take the case, Wolfe?" "It's just editorial tampering. No corpse, no blackmail, no scandal." He didn't look up. "Because, Archie, the sanctity of text matters, and because 3 buttons do not fall from a coat unless someone wants you to notice they're missing. That was Wolfe for you. Not justice for the dead, but for the written word, and for the subtle crimes we think no one will notice." The next morning, I was halfway through a bowl of Fritz's homemade muesli, heavy on the dried figs, light on joy, when Wolfe summoned me to the office with a bell ring sharp enough to make a banker flinch. That's always the sign he's reached a critical juncture in his internal filing system and has decided to let the rest of us catch up. I wiped my mouth, straightened my tie, and walked in. Wolfe was seated, as ever, in the throne-like yellow chair, a photocopied sheaf of the Iron Fleece manuscript in one hand, and a fountain pen poised like a sword in the other. His lips were pursed in a posture of contempt, reserved for errors of grammar, horticultural abuse, or poor-quality beer. "Archie," he said, "I require an arrangement." "Must be a serious morning," I said, easing into my own seat. "That word usually comes out only when you're planning a chess move or war." "It is war," Wolfe muttered. "A war on logic. This text has been violated. We must now confront the violators." He flicked his eyes to the envelope I had placed on his desk the night before, the one that contained Rachel Vernet's client. Dossier, it was slim but illuminating. "In your absence," he continued, "I reviewed the manuscript. Creel's annotations suggest not an editorial overhaul, but an ideological rewriting." I raised an eyebrow. "What's the ideology?" "The suppression of motive. The original conclusion, from the clues I can gather, indicted the protagonist. Creel's edits veer the reader toward absolution. It is subtle, but it changes the story's spine. You think Creel was pressured." Wolfe closed the manuscript and tapped it once. "Yes, and the pressure came from someone with access, knowledge of the book's meaning, and a stake in its revised perception." "Sounds like we need to talk to everyone who fits that bill." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Arrange meetings. Here, one at a time. This is not the Fulton fish market." So I got to work. By mid-afternoon, the brownstone was experiencing what Wolfe would refer to as unwelcome atmospheric instability. I call it people, specifically suspects, each carrying more emotional baggage than an airport carousel, and far less interest in being helpful. The first to arrive was Paige Merrow, literary agent and professional storm cloud. Short, brittle, and dressed like a Parisian librarian in mourning, she had represented Julian Creel for over a decade. "I told Julian not to take the job," she said, sitting primly on the edge of the red settee. "Too many moving parts. Ravenspur. Press has taste but no instincts. You can't build a literary reputation on gimmicks." "Meaning?" Wolfe asked, not bothering to hide his disdain for her cologne, which was potent enough to curl Fritz's basil in the kitchen. "Publishing. Forgotten novels with gimmicks, buttons, puzzles, annotated codes. That's not editing, that's marketing." She sipped the espresso Fritz had grudgingly delivered and looked at Wolfe as if daring him to argue. "Julian liked puzzles," she added, "but he also believed in integrity. If he changed something, in that book he had a reason, and if he walked away, that reason scared him." "Who else might he have confided in?" I asked. "No one. Maybe his brother Curtis, but they hadn't spoken in months." "Why not?" "They had a fight about inheritance, I think. Julian said Curtis had no respect for books or people who read them. Next came Curtis Creel, the brother in question, who showed up in a camel overcoat and a smile that came with its own echo. "A tragedy, really," he said as I took his coat. "My brother was a genius in the way only obscure geniuses can be. Quiet, anxious, and absolutely impossible at dinner parties." Wolfe studied him from the depths of his chair. "You have not reported your brother missing." "Because I didn't know he was missing," Curtis replied. "We haven't spoken since we disagreed on our parents' estate. Julian thought I was crass. I thought he was allergic to responsibility. Typical. You're aware he resigned from Ravenspur?" "Yes," I was surprised. "He didn't quit things, he just brooded them to death, but no, I haven't heard from him. And if something has happened, I'm sorry to say I couldn't be less useful." His tone was too polished. "I made a note to check his whereabouts during the week of Julian's disappearance. Before he left, he paused at the manuscript pages Wolfe had left open on his desk. Is this the book he was editing?" "Yes," Wolfe said flatly. Curtis frowned. "You know what's odd? Julian hated that book. He said it was a fraud, called it a murder without a conscience. The third guest was Marta Klein, Ravenspur's senior production editor. Middle-aged, unsmiling, with salt and pepper hair tied back in a clip that looked like it doubled as a disciplinary tool. She arrived precisely on time, and her handshake had the warmth of a filing cabinet. "I don't involve myself in creative disputes," she said. "My job is typesetting, fact-checking, sourcing paper. If Mr. Creel changed the manuscript, that was between him and Miss Vernay." "But you saw the edits," she paused. "I handled the proofs." "Yes. And I flagged several of his annotations. Some were unorthodox. He inserted references to events that aren't in the plot. I assumed they were typos." "Were they?" Wolfe asked. "No," she admitted. "Now I think they were clues." That got Wolfe to lean slightly forward, which in our world is the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Clues to what?" She lowered her voice. "He once told me the book wasn't fiction." Wolfe didn't blink. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said. "Julian believed the Iron Fleece was a disguised confession." Last came Leo Marquette, the author's last living relative and executor of the estate. He looked like a man who spent more time in vineyards than libraries. Tanned, elegant, and irritable, he declined the offer of coffee and hovered near the office globe, as if preparing a counter-offensive. "I don't care what the book says," he snapped. "It's literature, not litigation. My uncle wrote it to amuse himself during exile in Zurich. Any attempt to read it as autobiography is nonsense." "But if someone believed otherwise?" I asked. He narrowed his eyes. "Then they're fools, or vultures." "Were you aware of Creel's edits?" Wolfe asked. "I was aware he was obsessing over them. He kept pestering me for family letters, old diaries, drafts. I refused. He had no right." "Did you threaten him?" "No," Marquette snapped. "But I made it clear he was trespassing on family history. If he walked away from the project, good. Maybe he realized he'd pushed too far." When the last suspect left, Wolfe was silent for a full minute. The room felt heavier with their absence. "Well," I said, "we've got our circle. Motives include ego, inheritance, creative control, and good old-fashioned literary paranoia." Wolfe grunted. "And yet no one lies well. They speak too freely. It suggests guilt, but not necessarily of the same crime." I poured myself a drink. "So what's next?" He looked up at me, his eyes bright. "Next, we follow the threads those buttons replaced, and watch who begins to unravel." Wolfe's idea of movement was shifting a finger from one book to another. Mine was trekking half of Manhattan by foot, cab, or subway, asking questions people didn't want to answer. We had reached the point in the dance where Wolfe sat tight like a chess master and sent me, his trusty pawn, to stir the pieces. And since the board now included 4 suspects with more grudges than alibis, I had plenty of terrain to cover. I started with Paige Merrow. Her office on West 41st was exactly what you'd expect from a literary agent who fancied herself a gatekeeper of integrity. Shelves of half-read manuscripts, an antique Remington typewriter that probably hadn't produced a usable sentence since the Carter administration, and a framed rejection letter from F. Scott Fitzgerald, yes, the Fitzgerald, tacked like a medal above her desk. She greeted me with a smile that had all the warmth of chilled iron. Mr. Goodwin, come to extract more context, or just flirt with the truth? I never flirt with anything I don't intend to take to dinner, I said, easing into the hard-backed visitor's chair. Just trying to figure out why a literary editor drops a promising job, sends cryptic notes and goes radio silent. Paige leaned back and folded her arms. Julian was brilliant but fragile. He didn't cope well with pressure, especially when it came from sources he deemed unworthy. Sources like? She tapped her desk with 2 fingers. The Marquette estate. Leo was meddling, pressuring Julian for interpretive accuracy. That's code for sanitize what you don't like. You think Julian buckled? No, she said flatly. I think he snapped. I watched her for a moment. She had the posture of someone guarding a secret, tight jaw, unblinking eyes, fingers drumming just fast enough to break tempo. I shifted gears. Did he ever mention the buttons? Buttons? Her brow furrowed. I told her about the 3 ivory ones, how they'd been removed from Rachel Vernet's coat and included in a package with the book. Her lips pursed. That's the kind of thing he'd appreciate, layered metaphor, something tactile to represent damage. Except he didn't take them. No, she murmured. He wouldn't trespass like that, but someone who understood him might. I left her office with more ambiguity than clarity. Paige Merrow was telling the truth, or rehearsing it. Either way, she didn't like anyone reshaping a story. And if Julian had caved to outside pressure, she might have seen that as betrayal. Next up was Curtis Creel, Julian's brother. He lived in a loft downtown that could have doubled as a modern art gallery if you knocked over enough champagne glasses. Glass walls, steel shelves, and a series of minimalist canvases that looked like someone had sneezed at a typewriter. Curtis opened the door in a linen shirt and sockless loafers. Back so soon? I didn't realize I was expected, I said, stepping inside. Mind if I ask a few follow-ups? He waved at a leather armchair and poured himself a drink, something amber and expensive. Ask away, though I can't promise any new insight. You mentioned a falling out with your brother over your parents' estate. Yes, Julian wanted to donate the books and correspondence to some obscure university archive. I wanted them liquidated. I nodded. And now Julian's vanished after editing a book he claimed was a fraud. You don't find that strange? Curtis sipped. I find Julian's entire career strange. He spent years obsessing over forgotten authors and crumbling pages. If he disappeared, it's because something finally broke him. And you weren't involved? Curtis looked genuinely amused. I hadn't seen him in months. I have witnesses, if you care. I do, I said. Where were you last Friday? Montauk, with my girlfriend. Check my credit card receipts. I made a note. Then I showed him a photo of the ivory buttons. Recognize these? He leaned forward, squinted, and shrugged. Fashion's not my department. But something flickered, the kind of flicker you don't see unless you're watching very closely. I filed it away. After Curtis, I headed to Marta Klein's apartment in Queens. It was modest, clean, and filled with books, stacked in uneven towers beside every chair. She wore the same stern expression from the day before and offered tea in a chipped mug that said, "Comma Police." Let's skip the preamble, she said, sitting across from me. You think someone threatened Julian, and I think you're right. Well, that's refreshing, I said. What makes you so sure? She picked up a folder from the side table and handed it to me. Inside were copies of the marked-up manuscript pages. More annotations than I remembered. Blue ink, tight script, and growing erratic toward the end. "Look at the margins," she said. I did. One page in particular stood out. Next to a scene about a forged confession, Julian had written, "The lie is buried in the wool." Another read, "They want me to rewrite the crime as virtue." Julian wasn't editing, Marta said quietly. He was unraveling something, and someone didn't want it unraveled. "Who?" I asked. Her lips thinned. "My guess? Leo Marquette. He's obsessed with protecting his uncle's image. Could Julian have confided in you?" "He tried. I told him to be careful." "And the buttons?" She nodded slowly. "He once told me ivory was the color of exposure. Beautiful and dangerous," he said, "because it shows every blemish." That was poetic and troubling. Last stop, Leo Marquette. I called ahead, which he ignored, so I dropped by the vineyard estate he called home 2 hours upstate. If Curtis lived like a museum docent, Leo lived like Gatsby's disillusioned cousin. He met me on the back terrace overlooking a line of oaks. "You're persistent," he said. "It's in my job description," I replied. "I have a few new questions." He poured wine without offering any. "Make it fast." "You said your uncle wrote the Iron Fleece for amusement. But what if he didn't?" He turned. "You've been talking to Klein. She says Julian thought the book was a confession, or at least a mask." "Julian was a fantasist," Leo snapped. "He saw ghosts in grocery lists. The book is fiction." "Then why pressure him to edit it a certain way?" He stiffened. "I told him to honor the tone. That's not pressure. Threatening to sue over private letters, that hit." His mouth twisted. "Those letters were mine by inheritance. Or they contradicted the version you wanted published." He stepped closer, anger flaring now. "Listen, Mr. Goodwin. My uncle is dead. My name is attached to that book. I have every right to protect it from people looking to turn it into scandal, even if that means removing a few buttons." His jaw clenched. I didn't need Wolfe's brain to read that one. Leo was protecting something, whether it was legacy, profit, or personal shame, I didn't know yet. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was nearly 9. Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, lips twitching slightly, a look that meant he wasn't asleep, just calculating in lowercase. "Well," he said without opening his eyes. "Paige blames Leo. Curtis plays dumb but flinched at the buttons. Marta thinks Julian left clues in the manuscript, and Leo's hiding more than wine in his cellar." Wolfe nodded. "And you?" "I think Julian found something. Something he wasn't supposed to see. Maybe in the book, maybe in the letters. He started to expose it with edits." "And the buttons?" I shrugged. "Still symbolic, ivory for truth. 3 removed for 3 lies or 3 culprits." Wolfe opened his eyes. "No," he said. 3 witnesses. That was Wolfe. Always a step ahead. There's a specific kind of silence in Wolfe's brownstone that only happens when the air is heavy with thought and no one dares break it. That night, after I gave Wolfe the rundown on the suspects, the manuscript and all the awkward truths half glimpsed in other people's eyes, the brownstone went quiet. Not peaceful, charged, like the moment just before thunder breaks. Wolfe sat with his eyes closed, fingertips pressed together under his chin, looking like a statue commissioned by the gods of logic. I sat across from him, turning over the word witnesses in my mind. "You said 3 witnesses," I offered, mostly to confirm I hadn't misheard him through the fog of my own fatigue. "I did." "Not suspects?" He opened one eye. "No, witnesses. Each of them, Merrow, Curtis, Klein, know something about what Julian Creel discovered, And none of them has told us the whole of it, not because they orchestrated the crime, but because they fear exposure, either theirs or someone else's. Then what about Leo Marquette? Wolfe's lip twitched. Ah, now he's something else entirely. That man is not afraid of exposure. He's afraid of erosion, of losing control of a narrative he believes he owns. Erosion? Wolfe leaned back. Yes, the gradual collapse of the illusion he's built around the Marquette name. Julian threatened to erode it, first through edits, then through departure. Leo is not a man who tolerates deviation. Before I could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway. Not with beer or brandy, which would have been the standard end-of-night offering, but with an expression Wolfe hates even more than bland cheese. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "something has been disturbed." That got both of us on alert. Fritz doesn't use language like that unless he's genuinely upset, and Fritz's definition of disturbed usually translates to sacrilege. "In the kitchen," he said simply. We followed him downstairs. Wolfe, in his robe, me in my shirt sleeves, and entered the most sacred square footage in the brownstone, Fritz's culinary kingdom. It smelled faintly of smoked paprika and fennel, probably remnants of tomorrow's planned stew. Fritz pointed to the far counter. There, next to the polished rack of spice jars, sat a broken jar of white pepper, its lid unscrewed and its contents scattered like confetti across the granite. Now I've worked with Nero Wolfe long enough to know that if a man could kill with a glance, this would have been the moment. Wolfe walked to the counter and stared at the mess as though it were a murder victim. "I did not leave it like this," Fritz said. "I vacuumed the counter before turning in. The jar was intact." "Nothing else disturbed?" Wolfe asked. Voice low. "No, the door was locked, the windows too. Then someone entered with a key," I said, "or stayed past their welcome." Wolfe turned to me, and for a second the calm cracked, just slightly. "Archie, check the locks, all of them." I did. Front and rear doors locked, windows bolted, no sign of forced entry. But someone had been here. That wasn't speculation, it was fact. The kitchen was Fritz's altar. A misplaced spoon would have raised alarms. This was deliberate. Back in the office, Wolfe took his chair like a general returning to war after a symbolic loss, the say. "White pepper," he muttered. "Of all the jar—" "It's a warning?" I said. "No. Worse. It's a message," I frowned. "What kind of message?" "White pepper is subtle," Wolfe said. "Not bold like black pepper, it blends. It doesn't shout, it suggests. Someone is telling us they've seen what we've seen. They know we're close, and they can get in." "Would have been easier to leave a note," I said. He ignored me, then it clicked. "You think this is about the manuscript?" "Not just that," Wolfe replied. "This is about the structure beneath it, the scaffolding of truth." Julian Creel had started to dismantle. Why break the jar? "To show us," Wolfe said, "that something or someone in this house is no longer secure." The next morning I went over every room in the place. I found nothing out of order in my room, nothing disturbed in Wolfe's. But when I checked the office again, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before. On Wolfe's desk, tucked beneath the manuscript pages he'd left out for reference, was a single ivory button. Not in a pouch, not in a drawer. Sitting squarely on the blotter. Wolfe stared at it without speaking for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "It's not one of the originals. How do you know?" "The sheen is different, slightly more polished, less wear." I examined it under the desk lamp. He was right. The carving around the rim was less worn. No thread residue on the back. "Someone left it here deliberately," I said. Wolfe nodded. "And they were in the house long enough to find the manuscript pages. They left the button as proof." "Proof of what?" "That we are not the only readers. That gave me a chill, not because it was poetic, it was, but because it meant the trespass hadn't been symbolic. It was investigative. Someone wanted us to know they'd been here. Someone who could move undetected, plant a clue in Wolfe's fortress and vanish without leaving a trace. That afternoon, I called Saul Panzer. He arrived at 3 o'clock, in his usual rumpled coat and steady, unreadable expression. I briefed him on the pepper jar, the button, the manuscript. He listened without interruption, then said, "Give me 3 hours, I'll look for camera footage, back alley angles, anything." While Saul went hunting, I called Rachel Verney and asked her to come by again. She arrived within the hour, more. Flustered this time. Her gloves were off before she entered the office. "What's happened?" she asked. Wolfe gestured to the desk where the button still sat. Her eyes widened. "That's not one of mine." "We know," I said. She sat down hard. "What does it mean?" "It means," Wolfe said, "that the person who left it had access. They wanted to communicate without speaking." Rachel's eyes darkened. "It wasn't any of my stuff. We've changed locks, and no one knew I was here until I told them the day after." "Then someone followed you," Wolfe replied, "and entered here after your departure." Rachel looked ill. "Why?" Wolfe's gaze didn't waver. "Because you're getting too close to the wrong version of the truth." By evening, Saul returned. He hadn't found footage, too many shadows, too much overgrowth in the alley, but he had found something else. "The rear service door," he said, "shows signs of tampering, not forced entry, just finesse. The lock's internal cylinder is scratched. Someone picked it." That was all Wolfe needed. He rang the bell and summoned Fritz. "Fritz, we are being watched," he said. "Tomorrow change every lock in this house, front, back, cellar. Every key must be new." Fritz nodded solemnly. "And Archie," Wolfe said, "send word to Mr. Marquette." "Leo?" "Yes. Inform him we have discovered a visitor who left no card, and that we are expecting another. Let us see how he reacts when he knows he is not alone in playing games." That night, the brownstone returned to silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence we trusted. It had weight now, like a pause in a story where you realize the narrator has been lying to you all along. Wolfe smoked a rare second cigar. I sat by the window watching the street. Somewhere out there, someone was moving buttons. Someone who didn't just know the truth. They were trying to rewrite it. It wasn't the first time someone had violated the sanctity of Nero Wolfe's brownstone, but it was the first time they'd left behind an ivory calling card and scattered white pepper like a breadcrumb trail through a temple. I've dealt with trespassers before, men with guns, women with grudges, burglars with bad timing, but never a ghost who slipped in, planted a clue, and vanished without a footprint. Whoever they were, they didn't come for money or secrets. They came to send a message. Wolfe didn't like messages, not ones written without grammar or signed with a smirk. By morning, the locks were changed. Fritz oversaw the locksmith like he was a sous chef trying to fillet a salmon with a crowbar. Wolfe didn't supervise. He rarely watches labor unless it's done in Latin. But I could tell he was agitated. He stayed in the office instead of heading up to the orchids. That's his default behavior when he's thinking hard. He settles. Who into that chair like a banker waiting for a crash? "I want eyes on all of them," Wolfe told me after breakfast. "Mero, Klein, Creel's brother, and Marquette? You think one of them came back?" "No," he said simply. "I think one of them sent someone." So I divided the suspects, looped in Saul Panzer, and set the day's play. Saul would trail Curtis Creel and Paige Mero. I'd take Marta Klein and Leo Marquette, an arrangement that let me suffer less and question more. I started with Marta Klein. She was in Midtown that morning, attending a production meeting at a printer Ravenspur used for limited-run editions. She didn't notice me until I slipped into the lobby as she exited the elevator, holding a folder labeled Bindery Sourcing, Project Fleece. Miss Klein, I said as I caught her by the door. She froze. Her mouth opened slightly, either surprise or annoyance, but she didn't bolt. That's always a good sign. You followed me? Lightly, more like shadowing. Mind if I ask you something? Actually, several things. She sighed and gestured toward a coffee kiosk in the lobby. 10 minutes, I ordered black. She took green tea. We sat at a tiny metal table surrounded by architects on break and interns, trying not to spill macchiatos on their phones. I need to ask directly, I said. Do you have access to Wolfe's brownstone? She looked genuinely confused. No, I've never been there outside of our meeting. You didn't enter. It last night or early this morning? Absolutely not, I nodded. Then let's try this. Did you ever mention to anyone that you'd been there? She paused. Possibly. Rachel, of course, and Julian weeks ago. I might have mentioned it in passing to a colleague. Who? She frowned, thinking. Theo Berlin. He freelances for us, layout, typesetting, cover design. He's erratic but clever, interested in the history behind Fleece. He asked about the Wolfe meeting, but I didn't tell him details. I made a note. Is he the curious type? Too curious. Obsessed with hidden codes, typographic metaphors, things like that. Did he have access to the original manuscript? No, she said, but he begged for a scan. I finished my coffee. Then I'll beg for his number. While I tracked down Theo Berlin's contact info, Saul called in from a payphone, a habit of his that predates my career and outlasts logic. Curtis Creel spent the morning in Tribeca, pacing outside a bookshop. No phone calls, no meetings. He looked anxious, suspicious. Only if you've never seen a man sweat in a $400 coat, but I'll keep watching. And Paige. She went into a law office, spent 40 minutes, left with a document envelope. Which law firm? Leon, Greeley and Moss, that name hit. Julian Creel's name had surfaced in probate rumors connected to that firm. His will had reportedly been updated there 6 months ago. And if Paige had reason to be there, it wasn't likely for literary contract work. Good, I said. Keep watching her. Next stop, Leo Marquette. I found him where I expected, at his uncle's estate office, pacing a wine cellar that reeked of oak and self-importance. He wasn't happy to see me. You again? He said, standing near a row of vintage Burgundies. Don't you people call first? I've never liked phones, I replied. Too many wrong numbers. He grunted. I'm here about last night, I continued. Someone entered Wolfe's home, left behind a message. Leo's smirk vanished. What kind of message? A single ivory button, placed where it would be noticed. He blinked. What does that mean? It means someone thinks we're getting close, or they want to control what we find. Leo folded his arms. Well, I didn't send anyone, and if someone did that, it's not on my behalf. Are you sure? He bristled. You think I'd tamper with the detective's office? I'm not suicidal. No, I said, just sensitive about your uncle's book. Damn right I am. What was in the letters you wouldn't give Julian? He didn't answer. Did they prove the Iron Fleece was a cover-up, that your uncle fabricated a crime to hide a real one? Still nothing. Or, I said slowly, did Julian figure out the ending was changed by your uncle himself? Leo exhaled sharply. You're dancing near the edge, Mr. Goodwin. I stepped closer. Then tell me what's on the other side. But Leo turned away. You want a quote for your report? Try this. Family lies are still lies. But sometimes they're the only thing left keeping your name out of history's sewer. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting. I gave him everything. The notes, the Theo Berlin lead, Saul's update, and Leo's charming farewell. Did you find the typesetter? Wolfe asked. Not yet. But I've got his address. Want me to knock? No, bring him here. Tell him we're interested in historical fidelity and metafictional typesetting." "Wolfe," I said, "he left a button on your desk." "Yes," he replied, "which means he'll return for a reply." That night I waited in the front room while Wolfe reviewed the manuscript under lamplight. Around 11 p.m., I saw movement across the street. Not obvious, just a shift in shadows. I went to the door, opened it quickly, and stepped onto the stoop. Nobody. But there, tucked into the wrought iron curve of the railing, was a small envelope. Inside, a scan of a different page of the manuscript. Page 217, annotated in tight handwriting, to see. The margin someone had written. The crime was never in the text, it was the omission. That was it. I handed it to Wolfe, who took it without comment. His eyes flicked across the page. Then he smiled. Not smug. Not amused, focused. We weren't chasing a murder. We were chasing a revision. If Wolfe were a chess piece, he'd be a bishop who never moved unless the board begged for judgment. And by the time the envelope with that annotated manuscript page appeared on our doorstep, the board was begging. The margin note, "The crime was never in the text. It was the omission," was more than just an academic riddle. It was a declaration. Someone wanted Wolfe to know this wasn't about a clumsy forgery or editorial flourish. This was about erasure, intentional, precise, and buried, where only someone obsessive enough to read between the punctuation would ever find it. Wolfe sat at his desk like a statue of legal consequence and stared at the page for so long I thought it might burst into flames. "This," he finally said, holding it delicately between two fingers, "is not annotation. It is confession." "Whose?" I asked, leaning forward. "Not Creel's," he said. "The handwriting doesn't match the notes in the original photocopies Marta Klein provided. No, this is someone who came later. Someone attempting to restore something Creel removed, or perhaps what Creel refused to remove. Theo Berlin. Possibly. Or someone working with him." I let that sit for a beat before I spoke again. "Wolfe, if we're circling an omission, shouldn't we know what was omitted?" He gave me a look I'd seen only a handful of times, once when I brought him a bottle of brandy that turned out to be apricot liqueur, and once when a man tried to bribe him with a slab of truffle. "Parti." A look of pained disdain. "I do know what was omitted," he said. He picked up one of the earliest drafts sent over by Rachel Vernay at his request and flipped to a page near the end. He pointed to a passage that, at first glance, seemed innocuous, and the shepherd returned, wounded but wiser, with the fleece wrapped tightly under his arm. No questions asked, no answers demanded. "Compare it," Wolfe said, "to the annotated page from the edition Julian Creel was editing." I dug it out and matched the passage, and there it was, clear as day once you knew to look. In Creel's version, the line read, "And the shepherd returned, hailed and cleansed, bearing nothing but silence. The fleece remained in the cave." 2 lines, I said, "but completely different." "More than different," Wolfe said. "Contradictory. One implies retrieval, the other implies abandonment, but both conceal motive. You think someone, Creel maybe, altered the conclusion to mask an original crime. Not mask, complicate." Wolfe leaned forward now, his voice dropping. "Julian Creel stumbled onto something buried in the prose, a code, a clue, or a veiled account. And when he tried to reframe it, someone intervened, either to protect the story's integrity or to preserve a lie." I nodded. "And the button? A symbol of what was removed. The original truth. Extracted. The one nobody wants sewn back in." By mid-morning, Wolfe had shifted from contemplation to orchestration. He called Saul, gave him instructions that even I wasn't privy to. and ordered me to place calls to every principal in our now familiar cast of characters. "Tell them," Wolfe said, "that I will be holding a private conference at 4 o'clock. Today in this office. Attendance is required. Refusal will be interpreted as a confession of cowardice, if not complicity." "Shall I include that part?" I asked. Wolfe's mouth twitched. "Improvise tactfully." I started with Rachel Verney. She agreed without protest. Curtis Creel asked if it would be brief. I told him no. Paige Merrow gave me a cold. I assumed this was inevitable. Marta Klein said she'd bring notes. Leo Marquette. He paused just long enough to leave a bruise of silence. "Are you calling me as a courtesy or as a warning?" "Neither," I said. "I'm calling because Wolfe doesn't ask twice." "I'll be there," he said. "But if this is a theatrical ambush, you'll regret it." "I never regret a good ambush," I replied. The rest of the day passed in coiled anticipation. Wolfe had Fritz polish the silver coffee service, always a sign of war, and instructed me to reconfigure the chairs in the office into a semicircle. Not a courtroom, a symposium. At 3:30, Wolfe took his seat and closed his eyes. He didn't nap. He never does when tension brews, but he entered the mental stillness he requires before pouncing. At 3:52, they began to arrive. Rachel came. First, in the same tailored coat with now 2 buttons missing, a statement perhaps, or a coincidence of wardrobe fatigue. Curtis arrived with his collar half popped, and the air of a man who'd skimmed the blurb, but skipped the novel. Paige brought her handbag, and a look that could have curdled bourbon, Marta. Klein nodded formally, and took the seat nearest Wolfe's right hand. Like a trusted secretary in a courtroom of doubt, Leo Marquette arrived last, late by 7 minutes, and apologized to no one. "I see we've assembled the chorus," he said, glancing at the others with restrained contempt. Wolfe opened his eyes. "No," he said, "you've been assembled, and you will now listen." The room stilled. Wolfe began, as he always does, not with accusation, but with architecture. "You were all brought together by a book," he said, "a novel. One that you each touched, through editing, publishing, reviewing, inheriting, or simply observing. The Iron Fleece, a text that, for all its obscurity, contains within it a coded structure, a layered truth." No one interrupted. Even Leo was too curious. Wolfe continued. "Julian Creel discovered an anomaly in the text, perhaps in a footnote, perhaps a marginal symbol. He believed that anomaly suggested a concealed account, possibly autobiographical, possibly criminal. He made edits, yes, but not to obscure, to clarify, and then he disappeared." Curtis stirred. "He wasn't murdered, was he?" "No," Wolfe said. "Not in body, in role. He was removed as editor because he resisted control." Paige raised her hand. "Are you accusing me of removing him?" "No," Wolfe replied. "You defended him, but you lacked power." He turned to Marta. "You saw the annotations. The veiled commentary. You alerted no one." "I couldn't prove intent," she said. "True, but you feared consequence." Finally, Wolfe looked to Leo. "You, Mr. Marquette, had motive to sanitize your uncle's legacy. If Julian revealed that the Iron Fleece was not fiction, but a warped confession, your family name, already brittle, would fracture." Leo didn't flinch. "You're assuming too much." "I'm assuming little," Wolfe replied, "because we were sent a note, and a button, and this." He lifted the margin note from the envelope. "A page not from Julian's version, but from yours, the version you requested." Leo's jaw tightened. "Someone in your orbit, perhaps Theo Berlin, saw the conflict and chose to warn us." A silence hung. Then Leo said, "Even if what you say is true, there's no proof." "So there's this," Wolfe said, lifting the final draft of the annotated manuscript Rachel had brought in. He flipped to the back and held up the last page. It was blank, not just empty, omitted, a missing final chapter. Creel removed it, Wolfe said, because it contradicted the revision. The ending wasn't redemption, it was indictment. And then, as if summoned by Wolfe's chessboard mind, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Saul, holding a brown paper envelope. From Berlin, he said. He confessed. Didn't like being watched. Inside was a typeset page, a facsimile of the final chapter Creel had hidden. It began, "The shepherd returns, empty-handed, not from loss, but from guilt. The fleece never existed, only the illusion of virtue wrapped in cowardice." Leo Marquette stood. "This means nothing, it's symbolic." Wolfe shook his head. "It means you've been editing your uncle's shame into parable," and Creel refused to play along. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then Wolfe said, "Mr. Goodwin, call Miss Verney. Tell her the original ending has been restored." "And Julian?" Rachel asked. "Wherever he is," Wolfe said, "he will now be vindicated." Wolfe never liked theatre. To him, dramatics were the opposite of precision, a messy indulgence of the irrational. But that didn't stop him from constructing scenes with all the flair of a master dramatist. When he summoned people to the office, it wasn't to accuse them in a blaze of outrage. It was to rearrange them, like pieces on a board, until the right ones folded and the rest collapsed under their own contradictions. The chairs remained where they had been left in the previous confrontation, 5 of them arrayed in a semicircle, before Wolfe's desk like schoolchildren summoned to recite Latin declensions. Fritz had cleared the coffee tray, and Saul, having delivered Berlin's confession and the final page, remained unobtrusively in the corner, arms folded, eyes watching. Every blink and twitch. Leo Marquette stood beside his chair, rigid as a lamppost, staring down the recovered final page of the Iron Fleece, like it might bite him. "That's forgery," he said, voice sharp. "There's no proof it came from the original manuscript." "It is a typeset page," Wolfe replied calmly. "A facsimile created by Mr. Berlin from a draft Creel had shown him before his disappearance. Berlin kept it because, unlike you, he respected the page's truth. And when he realized someone had broken into my home, perhaps under your suggestion, he chose to deliver it." "That's hearsay," Leo snapped. "And yet here you are," Wolfe said, folding his hands, "with no further suggestions to, offer." Rachel Verney, seated again in the red leather chair, turned to Wolfe. "If this is real, if this final page is from the author's original draft, then Creel didn't just restore it. He tried to publish it, and someone stopped him." "Not stopped," Wolfe said. "Swayed. Creel never published the final page. He annotated the manuscript with doubt, frustration, and ultimately surrender." Marta Klein's voice cut through next. "But why surrender? He wasn't easily intimidated." "Because," Wolfe said, turning toward her now, "he knew that without the estate's cooperation, the truth would remain invisible. Even if he left the final page intact, you, Ravenspur, would not have the legal right to include it. The omission would be preserved, officially. He walked away rather than participate." "Then why the buttons?" Curtis Creel asked. He was less combative than before, but no less nervous. "What do the ivory buttons mean in all this?" Wolfe gestured toward the desk where the original pouch still rested. "A symbol of removal. The original coat had 4 buttons. Miss Verney lost 3, taken without force but with purpose. Each one marked a truth stripped from the book. Berlin left a 4th, newer, shinier, as a counterpoint. A replacement, or perhaps a restoration," I cut in. Berlin wasn't trying to threaten Wolfe when he entered the house. He was trying to deliver the missing piece and tell us that the crime wasn't in what was printed, but in what had been edited out. Leo shifted in his chair. "None of this proves intent. You're still drawing wild lines between fiction and a dead man's scribbles." Wolfe looked at him coolly. Your Uncle Leo was not merely writing fiction. He was transmuting an experience, an episode from his life, into metaphor. That's not unusual for writers. What is unusual is that he originally wrote the guilt, and then years later, as his legacy crystallized, he removed it, sanitized it, a shepherd without blood on his hands. You're speculating, Leo said, but it was hollow now. No, Wolfe said. I am reading. He lifted the final page again and recited aloud, "The fleece was not taken, it was left. Not from cowardice, but complicity. The shepherd was never meant to return triumphant. His silence was not redemption, it was pact." Curtis sat back, eyes wide. So the book was autobiographical? No, Wolfe said. Not strictly. But its moral framework came from something real, a betrayal, a lie maintained long enough to take on the shape of myth. Paige Merrow, who had been silent till now, finally spoke. I knew Julian had doubts. He told me the book didn't match itself. The first half sowed guilt, the second half erased it. He thought there had been a shift, an authorial sleight of hand. He was right, Wolfe said, and when he tried to restore the truth, he was told, by Leo I believe, that doing so would invite legal ruin, that the estate would sue, that his professional reputation would suffer. Leo said nothing. Rachel turned to Wolfe. So what happens now? That depends, Wolfe said, on you. She blinked. Me? You hold the power. You, Miss Vernay, can choose to publish the full version, with the final page restored. You can place the truth back where it was once erased, or you can choose the safer route, the Marquette-sanctioned version, the one that will sell, the one with redemption instead of rot. Rachel looked around the room, at Curtis, staring into the middle distance, at Paige, frowning but silent, at Marta, who gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, and then at Leo. I'm not afraid of lawsuits, she said softly, and I'm not afraid of family myths. She stood buttoning her coat, what was left of it. I'll publish the truth with an introduction explaining the restoration and a note about Creel's departure. Let the readers decide. Wolfe gave a slight incline of his head. That is your prerogative. Leo pushed back his chair. You'll regret this. No, Wolfe said. You will, because this isn't a loss of reputation. It is its exposure, and exposure, while inconvenient, is often the beginning of clarity. Leo opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned and left without another word. The rest followed. Curtis, subdued and shaken. Marta, quietly pleased. Paige, still processing. Rachel was the last to leave, but before she did, she turned to Wolfe. Thank you, she said. For what? For not just solving it, but for understanding that the crime wasn't blood or theft. It was revision. Wolfe, uncharacteristically, offered her something resembling a smile. Words are the most dangerous instruments, Miss Vernay, he said. They wound without blood and linger without form, but they are also the clearest justice we can offer. After they were gone, the brownstone fell into stillness again. Fritz brought beer, I poured mine. Wolfe didn't say anything for a while, just sat with his eyes half closed, listening to the silence like it had rhythm. Well, I finally said, that was one hell of a bibliography. Wolfe grunted. You ever think, I added, that maybe you should have been a novelist instead of a detective? Nus, Wolfe said. Novelists create, I excavate. Same tools, different dust. He finished his beer. You're sentimental tonight, Archie, I grinned. Yeah, comes with not getting murdered. The case of the 3 ivory buttons had started with a coat, a vanished editor, and a manuscript nobody could agree on. It ended with a chapter recovered, a family exposed, and a detective's office undisturbed again, at least for now. Because truth, like ivory, always leaves her mark when polished enough. Wolfe rarely bothers with grand announcements. When he solves a case, he doesn't stand up, doesn't point fingers, and doesn't draw diagrams on chalkboards. He speaks with the weight of inevitability, as if the conclusion had been there all along, lounging in the corner of the room, just waiting for someone clever enough to shine a light on it. That night, after the office cleared, and the echoes of Leo Marquette's indignation faded down the stoop, Wolfe remained in his chair. The final page of the Iron Fleece lay on his desk, centered and still like a body awaiting identification. Fritz brought the dinner trays without a word, braised rabbit with rosemary and a burgundy reduction, but Wolfe merely poked at the food. That was my cue. "You're not eating," I said. Wolfe grunted. "I've already consumed what I needed. Today, truth stew?" I offered. "No," he said. "The residue of deception." He tapped the final page lightly with one finger. "You see, Archie, the true shape of this crime is not in what was done, but in what was undone." I sat, propped my elbows on the arm of the chair. "Walk me through it." He didn't need much prompting. This began not with theft or assault, but with editorial interference. Julian Creel, while preparing the annotated edition, discovered that the novel had undergone significant alteration, likely from a draft version to its final printed form in 1934. Specifically, the ending was redacted, transformed from a moral indictment into a fable of quiet triumph, and he tried to reverse it. Wolfe nodded. Indeed, but he faced pressure. From the Marquette estate, perhaps indirectly at first, and then quite pointedly. Leo Marquette, who had inherited the intellectual property of the novel, and more, importantly its legend, wanted to preserve the version that exonerated the author. A redemptive ending upholds legacy. A confession corrodes it. Julian's notes show a man unraveling. "Yes," Wolfe said. He tried to slip truth back into the margins. When that failed, he reached out to others. Marta Klein, Theo, Berlin, leaving behind fragments. But ultimately he realized that without estate consent, the final page would remain buried. So he walked away. Correct. But not before leaving a trail. The anonymous package, the buttons, the margin clues. Theo Berlin took up his cause, quietly, with the same reverence Creel had. He typeset the omitted page and, when the brownstone was infiltrated, left a button to signal that the truth had found its way here. I leaned back, and Wolfe, ever the guardian of literary justice, took the case. Wolfe made a dismissive gesture. "I took the case because someone removed 3 buttons from a woman's coat without her knowledge. That act, precise, silent, and symbolic, was the overture. It told me the matter concerned subtle sabotage, not brute force." I nodded slowly. "So the buttons were a metaphor for truths stolen." 3 specifically, Wolfe said. Each button corresponding to one suppressed element in the original novel: the protagonist's guilt, the act of betrayal, and the conscious omission of the fleece. I stood and walked to the bookshelf where Wolfe kept rare texts, including a shelf dedicated to literary crime fiction. The Iron Fleece wasn't there, not yet, but its place had been made, an open slot between the hollow quill and the testament of the ink-stained widow. We got one final visitor, unexpected, unscheduled, and very carefully timed. It was Julian Creel. He arrived mid-afternoon on a Friday. I opened the door and blinked, thinking I was looking at a ghost. He looked thinner, grayer, but his eyes were the same, a little too sharp for comfort. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he said, "but I thought someone ought to say thank you." I didn't say anything, just stepped aside. He entered the office like a man entering a confessional. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He merely watched as Julian sat. "I saw the publication," Julian said. "I wasn't sure Rachel would go through with it. She did, Wolfe replied. She's braver than I was. Wolfe tilted his head. No, she was enabled. You left the door ajar. I left a mess. Not all messes are errors, Wolfe said. Some are revelations waiting for context. Julian nodded, silent for a beat. I still don't know, he said slowly, whether I was restoring the truth or just peeling back a veil that should have stayed in place. Wolfe's response was unusually gentle. The truth is not always about virtue, Mr. Creel. Sometimes it is about accuracy. Julian sat with that, then he stood. I'm leaving again, not running, just letting it rest. He paused by the desk. I left the 4th button, he said. Not Theo. That surprised me. I asked him to, Julian clarified. He was reluctant, said it was too clever, but I told him it would find the right desk. It did, Wolfe said. Julian nodded once more and left. The door closed softly. That night, over lamb with saffron risotto, Wolfe was in better spirits. The room felt lighter, the silence not so heavy. The chessboard was back in its corner. The manuscripts shelved, the margins no longer screaming. You know, I said between bites, there's something poetic about a man who rewrites his own ending. Only if he allows it to be read, Wolfe said. Fair point. Wolfe dabbed his mouth with his napkin and looked toward the kitchen. Fritz outdid himself tonight. He does that, I said. Not everyone likes to cut corners. Wolfe raised his glass in an uncharacteristically toasty gesture. To the ones who don't. I clinked mine against his. To the ones who notice when someone does. And so the brownstone returned to its habits. Books, beer, and cases that walked. In on 2 legs and lied in 3 sentences. But I remembered this one more than most. Not for the danger or the puzzle, but for the silence it broke, because sometimes the truth isn't shouted. Sometimes it's typeset, bound and buried, waiting for someone stubborn enough to read the footnotes.